Ruth sat by the window, watching the dusk settle over the land. The house felt too quiet, like it had been waiting for something. She hadn't moved much since the funeral and hadn't bothered to clean the dishes. It was all the same, just one damn thing after another. The sun hung low, staining the sky red, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the old ache return in her chest. The kind of ache that never went away, no matter how long it had been. She heard the creak of the front gate, the kind that came when someone heavy-handed pushed it open. Ruth stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and stepped into the doorway. A woman stood at the edge of the yard. Her clothes were torn and ragged, like she had been walking for days, maybe weeks. Her face was pale, dirt-smeared, and her eyes, those eyes were wild. Ruth didn't have to ask to know something wasn't right. There was an energy about the woman that made the air feel thicker. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, just staring. The woman spoke first, her voice rough, like she hadn't used it in a while. "I don't mean no harm, I'm just passing through." Ruth took a step back, uncertain. "You lost?" The woman shook her head. "Not lost, just hungry." Ruth didn't know what to make of her. The woman didn't look like anyone who'd find their way out here, but Ruth was used to strange faces showing up at her door. The land had a way of pulling in the broken ones, the ones who didn't belong anywhere else. "Don't have much," Ruth said, her voice flat. She didn't want to offer help, didn't want to invite a stranger in. But something about the woman, the way she stood, tense like she was waiting for the next blow, demanded something from Ruth. She couldn't explain it. The woman shifted on her feet. "Anything's better than nothing." Ruth hesitated. A moment passed. The woman's eyes were too intense, too raw. She seemed like someone who had nothing left to lose. "You're welcome to sit for a meal," Ruth said. Her voice was clipped. No need to act like it was anything more than what it was. The woman nodded, and Ruth stepped aside to let her in. The kitchen was small, quiet, the smell of old wood and dust filling the air. Ruth started putting together what little she had. A pot of beans, some bread left over from the morning, a jar of pickles. The woman didn't sit. She hovered by the door, her gaze darting around the room like she was sizing everything up. Ruth didn't offer to make her feel comfortable. She wasn't in the business of making people comfortable, not anymore. The woman sat at the small table when Ruth motioned for her to. Ruth set the food down, watching her for a long moment. She wanted to say something, but the words never came. It was too quiet. The woman tore into the bread first, her fingers moving fast like she hadn't eaten in a long time. Ruth didn't look at her directly, but instead kept her eyes on the stove, the heat from it, a quiet comfort. Ruth couldn't decide if she should say something or let the silence settle between them. The woman's presence was unsettling, but there was something about it, something magnetic. Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the woman didn't belong anywhere. But for some reason, she belonged here now. "Name's Alice," the woman said after a while, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She didn't look at Ruth, but Ruth felt the weight of the introduction. Ruth nodded, offering a short, "Ruth." Alice didn't ask anything more. Ruth didn't offer any more either. The food was simple, and the conversation was quieter than it should have been. Ruth noticed how Alice kept glancing around like she was on edge. She ate like she was starved. But it wasn't just hunger. It was like she was trying to fill some empty space inside her that no amount of food would ever fill. Alice finished eating quickly, and Ruth stared at the empty plate in front of her. Alice wasn't in a hurry. She was just here. Ruth tried to keep her distance, but it didn't work. There was something in the air between them now, something thick and unspoken. "You've been here a long time?" Alice asked, her voice low. Ruth paused. "Long enough." Alice met her eyes then, her gaze hard. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, but Ruth couldn't place it. "You lose someone?" she asked. Ruth stiffened. She wasn't sure how to answer. She didn't need Alice poking around in that part of her. "A while ago." Silence stretched. Ruth felt the weight of it in her chest. Alice leaned back studying her, and Ruth could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Alice wasn't trying to make her talk, but Ruth could tell she was waiting for something. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous habit. "What about you?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp. "Where are you from?" Alice looked out the window for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Doesn't matter." Ruth nodded, not knowing how to respond. It didn't matter. Nothing really mattered, not anymore. "Guess I'll sleep out back," Alice said suddenly, standing up from the table. "No need," Ruth said quickly, standing too. "There's a room upstairs. You can stay the night." Alice didn't argue. She just nodded, like it was something she expected to happen. Ruth watched her move toward the door, that same restless energy about her. Ruth's gaze lingered, unwilling to let the moment end so easily. She knew she should send Alice away, but something kept her rooted to the spot. "You sure?" Ruth asked. Her voice was quieter now. Alice paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She turned her head just enough for Ruth to see her face. "You offered." Ruth felt a pang in her chest, something she couldn't name. She nodded, turning away before she could think too much about it. "Upstairs," Ruth said, trying to sound more sure of herself than she felt. Alice didn't say anything else. She just left the kitchen, disappearing up the stairs. Ruth stood there for a long while, the weight of the house pressing down on her shoulders. She was too tired to think, too tired to care. But when the door closed behind Alice, something shifted in the air, something she couldn't shake. She didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of something neither of them could undo. The house felt different with Alice in it. Ruth had never been one for change, but the sharpness of Alice's presence stirred something in the silence that had settled here for years. It wasn't just the woman, it was the way she moved through the house with purpose, like she belonged. She'd taken to the kitchen in a way Ruth hadn't seen anyone do since he was alive. The first morning Alice made breakfast. The smell filled the house, thick and strong. Bacon frying, eggs scrambling, coffee brewing. Ruth hadn't smelled any of it for months, not since before the funeral. She stood by the door, her arms crossed, watching Alice work. "You know how to cook," Ruth said, her voice rough from too many quiet nights. Alice didn't look up, but Ruth saw the curve of her mouth twitch like she'd been expecting it. "Ain't hard," Alice muttered, her hands moving fast, chopping vegetables with a practiced speed. "You just do it." Ruth didn't say anything else. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't asked for any of this, but she couldn't deny that the food, the smell, the noise, it filled the empty spaces inside her. Ruth leaned against the doorway, watching Alice stir the pot with a kind of fierce focus, like the world depended on the food being just right. Alice looked up then, catching Ruth's gaze. "It's just food," she said, as if she knew Ruth had been staring. Ruth shifted uncomfortably. "Never said it wasn't." The room fell back into that uneasy quiet. Ruth didn't know why it bothered her, why she couldn't just let Alice be. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the company or the meal or the warmth in the house. It was something else. Something about Alice, about her quiet strength. Ruth wasn't used to it. It reminded her too much of the things she had buried deep inside. Later, Ruth sat at the table, picking at her food. Alice ate beside her, the silence between them more comfortable now. Ruth had stopped trying to fill it with words she didn't mean. She wasn't sure if Alice was waiting for her to say something, or if she was just giving Ruth space. The few times Ruth had tried to ask Alice about her life, the answers had been vague, always skirted around with a change of subject. Ruth hadn't pressed. It didn't feel right. Alice reached over and grabbed the bread, tearing off a piece with her bare hands. "You got a lot of work to do on the porch," she said casually. Ruth looked up, surprised. "What?" Alice's gaze flickered toward the porch, where Ruth's husband's old chair sat in front of the door. It had been broken for months. Ruth hadn't had the energy to fix it, not after everything. "That chair's seen better days." Ruth stared at the chair, her fingers tightening around her mug. She hadn't realized how much it bothered her until Alice spoke up. "I'll fix it," Alice said before Ruth could reply. "If you don't mind me taking a look at it." Ruth didn't know what to say. She nodded, her throat tight. "I guess you can." Alice didn't wait for permission. She stood, her movements swift, like she knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth watched her go, her hands still holding the mug, the warmth from the coffee slipping away as she was left alone in the kitchen. The next afternoon, Alice was outside, her hands working at the broken chair. Ruth stood in the doorway, hesitant to step outside. She wasn't sure why she felt so unsure. She watched Alice kneel down, using a few nails, hammering away at the old wood with an intensity Ruth hadn't expected. There was something fierce in the way Alice moved, like she wasn't just fixing a chair, like she was fixing something else, something inside her. Ruth finally stepped outside, her boots heavy on the porch boards. Alice looked up when she heard her approach, wiping her hands on her pants. "Don't worry about it," Alice said, as if Ruth had been concerned all along. Ruth glanced at the chair, now sturdier than it had been in months. "It's good," Ruth said quietly. Alice shrugged, but Ruth saw the small, barely there smile that tugged at her lips. She wasn't used to seeing people fix things for her. For the longest time, it had been Ruth doing everything herself, picking up the pieces, carrying the weight. She didn't know how to respond to Alice's kindness. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Ruth asked, her voice softer than she intended. Alice paused, then stood up straight, brushing the dust off her hands. She didn't answer right away, and Ruth thought maybe the conversation was over, but Alice didn't let it end just yet. "Didn't have a choice," Alice said, her voice flat but without bitterness. "When you don't have anything, you learn to make do." Ruth's chest tightened, and she didn't know why. She nodded, not trusting herself to say anything else. Alice was something else. She wasn't just a stranger passing through. She was a woman who had lived, who had been knocked down and gotten back up. Ruth could see it in the way she moved, in the way she didn't apologize for being who she was. Alice wasn't pretending. She was real. Over the next few days, Alice continued to fill the space in the house. She cooked meals with a skill that was more than just practicality. She filled the house with sound, the sizzle of frying meat, the clatter of dishes. Ruth found herself drawn to it, to her. There was something about Alice that kept Ruth at the edge of something she couldn't name. She was torn between wanting to close the door, shut the world out, and wanting to let Alice in. It wasn't just the food or the way Alice fixed the chair. It was everything. The way she carried herself, like she wasn't afraid to take up space, to demand attention. Ruth had spent so long tiptoeing around her own grief, her own loneliness, that Alice's boldness unsettled her. Still, she couldn't help but notice how much quieter the house was without Alice's presence, how much emptier it felt. Ruth hadn't asked for company, but Alice's rawness, her unyielding strength, Ruth couldn't ignore it. Ruth learned bits and pieces of Alice's past over the next few days, but the more Ruth learned, the less she knew. Alice never volunteered details, and when Ruth pushed too hard, Alice would stop talking, her eyes growing distant, guarded. But Ruth saw the way Alice would suddenly stop in the middle of a task, staring at nothing, her face hardening as if the past was closing in on her. One evening, after supper, Ruth found Alice staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. Ruth didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say, but something hung in the air between them, something unspoken. And for the first time, Ruth didn't feel so alone. Ruth woke to the quiet sound of a ticking clock. She wasn't sure what time it was, but it didn't matter. She sat up in bed, the room still and dark except for the moonlight spilling through the window. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything, even the weight of her own thoughts. The watch. It was always the watch. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the side of the nightstand, but it wasn't there. She blinked, rubbing her eyes. The watch had been there every night since he died. He'd given it to her before he left, before the war took him, and it had never left her since. She got out of bed, her feet cold against the floorboards. She walked over to the nightstand, her fingers trembling as she searched, but the watch wasn't there. The drawer was empty, the same way the house had been empty for so long. She ran her hands over the wood, her breath catching in her throat. The night felt colder. Ruth stood there, motionless, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Her chest tightened. She needed to see it, needed to know it was still there. The sound of her breathing filled the space. She turned around, eyes flicking toward the door, but it was just as quiet as before. She swallowed hard. She couldn't think about it now. Ruth moved back to the bed, her body heavier than before. The darkness pressed in, but her thoughts raced. Had she lost it, or had it been taken? She tried to ignore the strange sensation creeping over her, but the dream lingered. The dream where he had handed her the watch, his face pale, his hands shaking. She hadn't remembered the dream until now. The memory of him felt like a ghost, half fading, half present, and Ruth knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed her again. The next morning, Alice was already up. Ruth had expected to hear her moving around downstairs, the sounds of her footsteps, the clatter of dishes. She couldn't quite place it, but Alice had a way of filling a space without ever fully belonging to it. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Alice was bent over the stove, her hands steady as she stirred something in the pot. The scent of coffee and something rich filled the room. Ruth's throat tightened. She'd been alone for so long that Alice's presence, her confidence, made Ruth feel exposed, like she was living someone else's life. "You sleep all right?" Alice asked without turning around, her voice low and casual. Ruth nodded, though she wasn't sure if she had. "Just the usual." Alice hummed in response, her attention still on the stove. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, watching Alice move. There was a stillness about her, an intensity that seemed to take up more space than Ruth was used to. She felt herself drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, but she didn't know how to get any closer. "Smells good," Ruth said after a moment. She forced a smile, trying to sound casual. Alice glanced over her shoulder, giving her a small, almost invisible smile. "It'll be ready in a bit." She turned back to the stove, her movements efficient, practiced. "Have you ever thought about getting back out there?" Ruth's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Outside, the town, people. You've been keeping to yourself too long." Ruth felt the weight of the question settle on her chest. She hadn't thought about it. She hadn't wanted to. She hadn't wanted anything to change, not after everything. But standing there, watching Alice, she couldn't help but wonder. She felt her grip on the past, on her grief, slip just a little. It wasn't much, just a crack in the wall, but it was enough to unsettle her. Enough to remind her how long it had been since she'd really felt anything at all. "I don't know," Ruth muttered. "Maybe." Alice turned off the stove and set the pot aside. "You can't stay here forever," she said softly, not unkindly. Ruth's throat tightened, but she didn't know what to say. She could hear the hum of the house around her, the quiet that filled the space when Alice wasn't there. The silence was always louder when Alice was nearby, and Ruth wasn't sure if it was because Alice was new or because Ruth was losing herself in it. Later that night, Ruth lay awake in bed, the house settling around her. She hadn't heard any noise, but the air felt heavy. The small, unnerving kind of quiet that made her want to look over her shoulder. She had heard something before, she was sure of it, but now it was gone. The sound was a whisper, just a flicker of noise in the corner of her mind. Ruth held her breath, a creak, a snap of wood. She opened her eyes, staring into the dark, the weight of the night pressing down on her. It was like the house was alive, watching her, waiting for something. She could hear her heart thumping, but that was all. The smell hit her next, smoke, the faint unmistakable odor of something burning. It wasn't strong, but it lingered in the room, settling into the air. Ruth shot out of bed, her feet cold on the floor as she rushed toward the door, her body rigid with sudden tension. She made her way down the hall, her eyes darting from one corner to the next. Nothing. The house was empty, quiet, nothing burning. The smell faded as quickly as it had come. Ruth stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence that had returned. The house felt colder again. Her chest tightened, but she tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the wind, just her mind playing tricks. But it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like a trick at all. In the morning, Alice didn't mention it. Ruth didn't either. The day moved on like any other, though Ruth couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Later, as they sat together at the table, Alice spoke quietly, almost to herself. "You okay?" Ruth met her eyes, her hands still, trembling slightly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Ruth had begun to see it now, the way Alice filled the house with her energy, with something that Ruth didn't know how to handle. It was more than just a company. It was a shift in everything. Alice wasn't just a stranger passing through anymore. She was becoming a part of Ruth's world, a world Ruth had never expected to share with anyone. And she wasn't sure if that was what she wanted. Ruth scrubbed at the kitchen counter, her hands working in rhythm with the weariness she couldn't shake. The house was quiet. Too quiet, but it always was. Alice was somewhere else, probably outside, her boots crunching on the dry earth. Ruth didn't know why the silence bothered her now. It had been her constant companion for so long. She reached for the rag and wiped at the wood, a dull ache in her chest as she moved in the well-worn motions of cleaning. Her hand brushed against the corner of the counter, knocking something off. The frame hit the floor with a sharp crack. Ruth froze. She stared at the broken glass for a long moment before kneeling down to gather the pieces. The picture inside was of him, her husband, taken long before the end, before the war, before everything fell apart. She picked up the shattered glass, her fingers trembling. His smile, so full of life, stared back at her. She didn't want to remember that smile. Not now, not like this. The sound of Alice's footsteps came from the doorway. Ruth didn't look up. "You okay?" Alice's voice was low, steady. She wasn't asking because she cared. She was asking because she'd noticed the way Ruth's hands were shaking. Ruth didn't answer at first. She just stared at the pieces, at the way the glass reflected the light, like it was trying to keep the past alive, even as it cracked and fell apart. "Ruth," Alice said again, softer this time. Ruth's breath hitched, and before she could stop it, the words spilled out. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of it." Alice didn't move closer. She stood there, waiting. Ruth didn't want to break. Not here. Not now. But it was too much. She felt the weight of everything pressed down on her chest, all the years of keeping it together, of pretending she didn't feel the emptiness. It was like the walls were closing in. She couldn't breathe. "Don't," Ruth whispered. "Don't come any closer." Alice didn't argue. She didn't try to touch her. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching, her eyes steady, like she was waiting for Ruth to do whatever it was she had to do. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Ruth finally stood, brushing the glass shards off the floor and into her hand. She didn't look at Alice as she walked toward the trash. Alice followed her into the kitchen, the quiet still hanging in the air. Ruth threw the broken frame away, then leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't sure what to do with herself now. The house felt too small, the air too thick. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" Ruth asked suddenly, her voice thick. She didn't mean for it to sound like that, but it did. "Leaving?" Alice's voice was guarded, but Ruth could hear the edge in it. "You think I'm going to leave?" Ruth shook her head, her fingers gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. "I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Alice stood a little straighter, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Ruth?" Her tone wasn't demanding, but it was sharp. Ruth didn't answer. She couldn't. Alice took a step closer, her boots quiet on the floor. "What's your plan, huh? Keep pretending he's still here? Keep hiding from everything?" Ruth swallowed hard. She didn't want to answer, didn't want to admit what she was feeling, what she had been feeling. But Alice's gaze was unrelenting, and Ruth felt a crack form in the walls she'd built up around herself. "I'm not pretending," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know how to move on." "You don't have to," Alice replied, her voice soft. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing next to Ruth, close enough that Ruth could feel the heat radiating off her. "You just have to stop hiding." Ruth's chest tightened. She felt something stir inside her, something she couldn't name, couldn't even understand. But it was there, flickering in the quiet. She wanted to pull away, to retreat into herself, but the warmth of Alice's presence held her still. Alice wasn't saying anything about the past, not about the war or the betrayal that Ruth had buried deep. She didn't need to. Ruth could feel the weight of it between them, something unspoken, something they both carried, but never said aloud. Alice wasn't running from her past. Ruth could see that in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she didn't hide from anything. "I can't keep doing this," Ruth said, her voice raw. "I can't keep pretending like it doesn't hurt." She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. "You don't have to do anything," Alice said, her voice calm. "You just have to be here, right now." Ruth shook her head, turning away from Alice, the room suddenly too small. "I don't know what you want from me." Alice's voice was steady, unwavering. "I'm not asking for anything, Ruth. I'm just asking you to stop pretending you're fine." The silence between them grew heavy again. Ruth stood there, her back to Alice, her shoulders tight. She could hear Alice breathing softly behind her, waiting for Ruth to do whatever it was she needed to do. "I don't know if I can," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. Alice didn't say anything, But Ruth felt the quiet understanding settle between them. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what Alice wanted from her. But it didn't matter. For the first time in so long, Ruth felt like someone understood. The house wasn't just filled with the memory of the past anymore. It was filled with something else, something new, something that wasn't just the absence of him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Ruth said again, her voice smaller this time. "You don't have to figure it all out," Alice replied, her voice quieter. "Not yet." And for the first time in a long time, Ruth believed her. Ruth was in the barn when she heard the horse. It wasn't the sound of just any rider. It was too fast, too desperate, like someone trying to outrun the world. She straightened up, wiping the sweat from her forehead, her gaze turning toward the driveway. She could see him then, a man riding hard, his horse kicking up dirt as it neared the house. Ruth stood there for a moment, unsure, until the horse came to a stop at the gate. The man dismounted quickly, his boots thudding on the ground. He was tall, his features sharp under a weathered hat. Ruth couldn't tell if he was familiar, but his presence made her uneasy. The man looked up toward the house, his eyes scanning the porch before he started toward it. Ruth's heart began to race. She hadn't seen anyone like him before. He wasn't from around here. Alice emerged from the side of the house, wiping her hands on her pants. Ruth's eyes locked onto her. There was something in Alice's face, a sudden shift, something that Ruth couldn't place. The man stopped when he saw her, a cold smirk crossing his lips. "Is that her?" the man asked, his voice low. Alice didn't answer right away. She stopped a few feet from him, her posture rigid, like she was preparing for a fight she didn't want. "Yeah," Alice said finally, her voice quiet but sharp. Ruth stayed where she was, her hand gripping the wooden beam of the barn. Her mind raced. Who was this man? And why did Alice look like she wanted to disappear into the dirt beneath her feet? "You need something?" Alice asked, though it wasn't an invitation. It was a command. The man's gaze lingered on her, his lips curling into a half smile. "I'm just here to talk. Ain't nobody else around?" "Doesn't matter," Alice replied, her tone clipped. "What do you want?" Ruth felt a chill creep over her, but she didn't know why. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something that didn't sit right. She stepped out of the barn, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Who is he?" Ruth asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Alice didn't turn to look at her. She kept her eyes on the man. "Someone I used to know." Ruth's gaze flicked between the two of them, the tension hanging heavy in the air. The man hadn't moved, still standing with his arms crossed, his eyes flicking to Ruth before returning to Alice. Ruth noticed the way his eyes narrowed, like he was taking stock of her. The silence stretched. "I don't need you dragging her into this," the man said finally, his voice low but forceful. Alice's jaw tightened. "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore." Ruth felt a pang of confusion, but it was quickly replaced by something else. A sinking feeling. She didn't know what it was, but it made her want to turn away, to go back inside and lock the door. She couldn't ignore the man. There was something dangerous about him, something familiar, but she didn't know why. "Look," the man said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for her, and if she wants to keep playing pretend, that's on her." He turned to Ruth, his eyes cold. "But you should know, you're trusting a liar." Ruth's stomach dropped, her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't speak. The words hung in the air, but they were too heavy to touch. Alice's eyes flickered, a momentary crack in her resolve. But she didn't speak. The man turned, his voice carrying on the wind. "Just remember, you can't run from your past forever. It's always going to catch up." He gave Alice one last look, his face hard, before he mounted his horse and rode off, his silhouette fading into the distance. Ruth stood still, her hands at her sides. The only sound was the faint clatter of the horse's hooves fading away. The dust settled, but the air between her and Alice didn't. Alice remained silent, her back stiff as she watched the road. Ruth took a step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who was that?" Alice didn't answer at first. She turned, her gaze cold, but there was something else in her eyes, something Ruth couldn't understand, something hidden. "Just someone I knew," Alice said, her voice guarded. "Doesn't concern you." Ruth felt a knot in her chest. That didn't feel like just someone you knew. Alice's eyes flicked to the ground. "You don't know anything about me, Ruth, so don't act like you do." The words stung. Ruth opened her mouth to respond, but Alice cut her off, her voice sharper than Ruth had heard it before. "Don't ask," Alice said, her gaze hard. "There's things I've done, things I can't undo, and you're better off not knowing. You're better off just letting me be." Ruth swallowed, her throat dry. Her desire to protect Alice, to understand her, only grew stronger. But there was something Alice was keeping from her, something that felt like it could tear them apart. Ruth stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I'm not asking to know everything, but I can't just pretend this isn't happening. You're not alone, Alice." Alice's expression softened for a moment, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She took a step back, her shoulders tense. "I didn't ask for your help," Alice said, her voice strained. "I didn't ask for any of this." Ruth stood there, watching her, unsure of what to do. Alice's walls were back up and Ruth couldn't break through them, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Liar. Ruth felt a deep, unsettling twist in her gut. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think Alice was hiding something darker. But the man's cryptic warning kept gnawing at her. Was Alice running from something? Or was she the danger? Ruth watched Alice standing in front of her like a stranger. She couldn't protect her if she didn't know the truth, but Alice wasn't ready to give it to her, and Ruth wasn't sure how long she could wait before everything started to unravel. The sun had barely risen when Ruth heard the familiar sound of the man's boots on the dirt road again. This time, his footsteps were slower, deliberate, like he was sure of what he was doing. Ruth was already awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in 1,000 directions. The house was still, but her mind wasn't. She went to the window and saw him, the same man from before, standing near the gate just outside the yard. His silhouette was stiff, unyielding, and for a moment, Ruth thought he might leave. But then Alice appeared. She stepped onto the porch, barefoot, her eyes scanning the horizon before settling on the man. Ruth's heart began to race. She felt the tension in the air before they even spoke. The man took a few steps forward, his voice low but harsh. Ruth couldn't hear the words, but she could see the aggression in the way he moved. He wasn't here to ask for help. He was here to claim something, to take something. She didn't know what to do. The urge to run, to hide, to lock herself inside with Alice was strong, but she couldn't. Not now. Alice was outside, facing him. Alice wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. But Ruth knew she should be. Ruth stepped away from the window, her feet carrying her toward the door. She didn't want to see it. I didn't want to hear it. But something told her she had to. She opened the door slowly and stepped outside, the cool morning air stinging her skin. She didn't know how to make it stop, how to stop this from happening, but there was no turning back now. "Go back inside," Alice said without looking at her. Ruth hesitated. "Number, I'm not going anywhere." Alice turned her head, her gaze hard. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," the man sneered. "She's just like you, isn't she?" His words were venomous, meant to sting. Ruth's stomach tightened, but Alice didn't flinch. "I said go inside," Alice repeated, her voice firmer, colder. But Ruth wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let this man, whoever he was, tear into Alice, into what they had. She couldn't. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this alone." Alice didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her posture rigid. The man lunged. It happened fast, like something snapping, an animal's instinct to survive. He grabbed Alice's arm, spinning her around, and Ruth saw the flash of violence in his eyes before the rest of the world stopped. Without thinking, Ruth ran forward. She grabbed the man's arm and yanked him off Alice, her fingers digging into his sleeve. He swung around, his free hand catching Ruth's wrist, but Alice was already on her feet, pulling away from him. "You don't get to touch her!" Ruth spat, her voice low but sharp. She felt the heat of the fight, of everything building up to this point. "You're not welcome here." The man sneered again, but Ruth didn't care. He was nothing to her now. The way he had looked at Alice, the way he had tried to push her back into whatever past they both shared, it sickened her. The man looked between the two women, the tension thick in the air, but then, without another word, he turned and walked away. His footsteps were slow, measured, and Ruth watched him go, her breath still quick, her body trembling. Alice stood behind her, her eyes locked on the man's retreating figure. Ruth didn't move, didn't say anything, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy between them. "I didn't want you involved," Alice said, her voice quiet. There was no anger in her words, only exhaustion. Ruth turned slowly to face her, her heart pounding in her chest. "You shouldn't have had to do it alone," Ruth replied, her voice raw. Alice didn't say anything. She just stood there, her body tense, her hands clenched at her sides. Ruth took a step forward, but Alice didn't move to meet her. She stayed still, almost as if she were waiting for something to break, for something to change. Ruth's mind raced, torn between wanting to understand what had just happened and wanting to shut it all out. She wanted to know. She needed to know what had brought this man to their doorstep, why he had looked at Alice the way he had, and why she had kept it from Ruth. But the words were hard to find. Alice spoke again, her voice soft. "You want to know who he is?" she asked, her eyes meeting Ruth's. Ruth nodded, her throat dry. "I need to know." Alice's face softened for the briefest of moments. Then, without warning, she took a step back, putting distance between them. "He's a part of my past I can't outrun," she said quietly. "He's someone I thought I could leave behind, but I was wrong. I left him. I left everything. And it wasn't enough." Ruth could feel the weight of her words. They hung between them, unsaid, like a secret that had been too long buried to ever come out clean. "You don't have to tell me," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I need to know if I can trust you, if I can trust what we have." Alice turned her face away, her gaze flickering to the house. "I'm not asking for your trust," she said, her voice strained. "I'm just asking for a chance." Ruth felt the shift in the air, the realization that she couldn't go back to how things were. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She looked at Alice, at the woman standing before her, broken, strong, vulnerable, and for the first time, Ruth understood. She understood the depth of the lies Alice had carried, the weight of everything she'd run from. Ruth didn't know what was coming next, but she couldn't walk away. "I'm not going anywhere," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady, filled with more certainty than she thought she had. Alice didn't respond. She didn't need to. The air between them had shifted, and they both knew it. What they were now, what they would become, had already begun. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into the bones of a house. Ruth stood in the living room, the dust motes floating in the golden light of the fading day. The house felt different now, not like it was just hers anymore. The way Alice had moved through it, the way she had started fixing the broken pieces, Ruth couldn't deny it anymore. It wasn't just her house, it was theirs, whether Ruth was ready for it or not. They had spent the day together, fixing what had long been left undone. Alice had repaired the creaking floorboards in the hallway, the ones Ruth had never gotten around to. Ruth had fixed the cracks in the walls, her hands working with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. They hadn't said much, just worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements saying more than words ever could. Ruth could feel the weight of the day on her shoulders, but there was something else there now, something heavier. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on Alice until the evening settled in. She hadn't realized how much Alice had become a part of the space until she wasn't just someone passing through. Alice's presence in the house was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Ruth couldn't remember what it had felt like to be alone in the house before Alice had arrived. The emptiness she'd lived with for so long seemed like something from a different life now. Ruth stepped into the yard later that night, her body sore from the work. She walked toward the edge of the property, her boots sinking into the earth as she moved. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to be outside, but it was the only place where the quiet didn't feel suffocating. She walked farther than she had before, past the old fence line, toward the grove of trees at the edge of the land. And that's when she saw it. The ground was disturbed, the earth turned up and uneven. It was almost hidden, tucked away between the trees like it didn't belong. A grave, unmarked. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She bent down, her hand brushing the dirt. The smell of earth, of decay, filled her nostrils, and she felt something chill run down her spine. There was no marker, no name, nothing to say who had been buried here. It was just a hole in the ground, but it wasn't just the grave that unsettled her. It was what it meant. The earth had been disturbed long before Alice arrived. This wasn't something new, but it was something that Ruth couldn't ignore. It was a part of the land, a part of the house, a part of the history Ruth had never asked about. She stood there for a long time, staring at the unmarked grave, her thoughts spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was something Alice knew about, something Alice hadn't told her. It made her uneasy, but more than that, it made her feel like the walls Ruth had built between herself and Alice were thinner than she realized. Ruth turned to head back to the house, but before she could take a step, she heard Alice's voice behind her. "You found it?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She just turned to face Alice, her body heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. Alice stood at the edge of the yard, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. "A grave," Ruth said finally, her voice quiet. "Who was buried there, Alice?" Alice didn't move for a long moment. Ruth could see the muscles in her jaw tighten, could see the walls she had built around herself go up again, just like that. "It's nothing," Alice said, her voice too calm. "Just something from a long time ago." Ruth's heart sank. She wanted to push, to ask more questions, but she couldn't. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth. "Alice," but Alice shook her head, stepping back, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "You think you can just dig up everything, Ruth? You think you can fix what's broken here? Some things stay buried." Ruth's chest tightened. The sharpness in Alice's voice wasn't like the harsh words of before. It was something deeper, something raw. "What happened here?" Ruth asked, her voice softer now. Alice didn't answer right away. She just stood there staring at the ground, her fists clenched at her sides. Ruth wanted to reach out, wanted to pull Alice closer, but she didn't know if she had the right to. She didn't know if Alice would let her. "I can't run from it anymore," Alice said, her voice breaking. Ruth watched as Alice's shoulders slumped, the tension in her body draining away. "I left everything behind once, and it's still here. It never really goes away." Ruth took a step toward her, her hand hovering, unsure. "I don't want you to run, Alice. I want you to stay." Alice met her gaze then, her eyes soft, the hardness of her exterior cracking just a little. "You don't know what it means to stay," Alice said, her voice shaking. "I can't ask you to do that, not after everything." Ruth's heart ached. She took another step, her hand finally resting on Alice's arm, the touch light, but firm. "I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now." Alice's eyes flickered with something Ruth couldn't name. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. The space between them was thick with things unsaid. "I don't know if I can let you in," Alice said, her voice quiet but honest. "I don't know if I can let you see what's left of me." Ruth didn't know how to respond, but she couldn't leave it at that. She had spent so long closing herself off, hiding from the pain, from the fear of losing more. She wasn't about to let Alice do the same, not now, not after everything they had shared. "You don't have to do this alone," Ruth said softly. Alice didn't answer. She didn't need to. But Ruth felt something shift, something unspoken, but real. And for the first time, Ruth understood. Alice wasn't just someone filling the emptiness in her life. She was someone who had lived, who had fought to survive just like Ruth had. And together, maybe they could begin to heal the wounds neither of them knew how to fix. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the possibility of what they could become, of what they could share, even if the past would never fully let go. The morning air was still and thick, the kind of stillness that made the world feel smaller. Ruth stood by the door, her eyes on the horizon, the silence in the house suddenly too heavy. It wasn't just the land, or the house, or even the barn. It was the sense of something coming. She couldn't shake it. Alice was at the kitchen table, picking through the mail the same way she always did, quiet, focused. Ruth watched her, unsure of what to say. The walls between them had been breaking down slowly, piece by piece. The unspoken things between them, the things Ruth hadn't known how to voice, were now just there. But that still didn't make it easy. The quiet was interrupted by the sound of a truck approaching, loud, intrusive. Ruth's stomach tightened. She didn't have to look out the window to know who it was, the sheriff. He'd been a part of her life since she was a child, always showing up when things were unsettled, always sticking his nose in places it didn't belong. "Alice," Ruth said, her voice low. Alice didn't look up from the mail. "I know." Ruth's fingers gripped the edge of the doorframe. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice finally looked up, her eyes locking with Ruth's. She didn't say anything, but the weight of her gaze was enough. Ruth didn't need her to say the words. She could feel it, the hesitation, the fear that something was about to change. Alice stood up slowly, her body stiff, the unease in her movements too familiar. Ruth could hear the truck's engine rumbling outside, the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires. She knew what was coming, knew what the sheriff's visit meant. The quiet life they had started to build was fragile, and she had known all along that it wouldn't last. But standing next to Alice, watching her face, Ruth realized something else, that she wasn't going to let Alice face it alone. Not this time. The sheriff knocked at the door, his presence as imposing as ever. Ruth opened it, her jaw clenched, her heart thumping in her chest. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, a man used to being in control. His eyes flicked past Ruth and settled on Alice. "Alice," the sheriff said, his voice gruff, like he hadn't spoken to anyone but his own reflection in years. "I need to talk to you." Ruth stepped in front of Alice, her posture defensive. "What about?" she asked, her voice firm. The sheriff eyed her, his gaze lingering. "It's between me and her, Ruth." Alice moved up beside Ruth, her body tense. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ruth could feel the weight of her silence, the history that hung between them. She didn't know what the sheriff wanted, but she knew what he was here for. Alice's past. "Whatever you've got to say, you can say it in front of me," Ruth said, her voice steady but sharp. The sheriff sighed, clearly irritated. "This ain't your business." Ruth didn't budge. "It is now." She stood taller, the decision already made in her mind. She wasn't backing down, not for Alice, not for anyone. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. He looked at Alice for a long moment, like he was waiting for something to change, for her to back down, to give him what he wanted. But Alice didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer him an explanation. "You're not welcome here," Alice finally said, her voice low. The sheriff didn't respond. He just turned on his heel and walked back to his truck without another word. Ruth watched him go, her chest tight. It wasn't over. It never was. But for now, he was gone. Alice turned to Ruth, her expression unreadable. There was a tension in her shoulders and the way she held herself. Ruth stepped forward, her voice softer now. "You didn't have to face him alone." Alice didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at the ground, her eyes focused on the dirt between her boots. Ruth waited, her heart thudding in her chest, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Alice looked up. "I didn't want you to see that," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to know who I really am." Ruth took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't care about your past, Alice. I care about who you are now." Alice's eyes softened for a moment, a crack in the walls she had built around herself. But it didn't last long. She turned away, walking toward the kitchen. "You don't understand," she muttered. Ruth followed her, the weight of her words heavy in the air. "Maybe I don't, but I'm here, Alice. I'm not going anywhere." Alice stopped, her back to Ruth. "I'm not asking you to stay. You don't have to." Ruth felt her heart sink. She didn't want to fight anymore. She didn't want to pretend like it was easy. It wasn't, but that didn't mean she was going to walk away. She couldn't. "Then why are you pushing me away?" Ruth asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Why can't you just let me be here?" Alice's shoulders tensed. She didn't turn around, but Ruth saw the tightness in her back, the way she was holding herself, like she was waiting for something to break. Finally, Alice spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Because I don't know how to let anyone in. I've lost so much, Ruth. I can't keep losing people." Ruth felt her chest tighten. She didn't have the answers, but she knew this. She wasn't leaving. Not now. Not after everything. She stepped forward again, her hand resting lightly on Alice's arm. "You don't have to do this alone," Ruth said again, her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Alice turned slowly, her eyes meeting Ruth's. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Ruth could see it in her eyes, the vulnerability, the fear, the trust that was slowly being given. The bond between them had shifted, and Ruth knew without a doubt that she couldn't walk away. She wouldn't. The town would talk. The sheriff would come back. The past would come knocking again. But for now, in that moment, Ruth made a choice. She wasn't just standing by Alice, she was standing with her. And that was something she wasn't going to let go of. The town had been talking for weeks. Ruth could feel the weight of the gossip on her skin, like the heat of the midday sun that never let up. It wasn't the kind of talk that was subtle or behind closed doors. It was loud, clear, and suffocating. The kind of talk that cut into the bones of a place, spreading through the streets like wildfire, burning everyone it touched. And Alice was at the center of it. Ruth had known it would happen. People didn't like change. They didn't like things they didn't understand. And Alice had become everything they couldn't control. Ruth was in the kitchen when the knock came at the door. She had expected it. She had known it would come. She had spent too long avoiding it, hoping it would fade away, but it hadn't, and it wouldn't. The weight of the town's judgment hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, her heart steady but her mind racing. When she opened it, there they were, the town's collective judgment standing on her doorstep. A few faces she knew, some she didn't. They didn't speak right away. They just stood there, waiting. Ruth's eyes swept over them, her shoulders straightening. She wasn't going to back down, not this time. "I'm not going to tell you what to think," Ruth said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not going to let you spread lies about Alice either." The woman at the front of the group, the one with the sharp eyes and the pointed chin, spoke first. "You don't know what she's done, Ruth. You don't know who she really is." Ruth's hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't move. "I don't care who she was. I care who she is now." The woman scoffed, but Ruth didn't look away. She held her ground, her gaze steady. She had spent too long hiding from the truth, from the past, but not anymore. "I know what she's been through," Ruth continued, her voice low. "I know what she's running from, but she's not running from me." The group was quiet for a moment, their eyes shifting from Ruth to the ground, then back again. Ruth could feel their discomfort, the tension in the air, but she didn't back down. She wasn't going to. "She's done things, Ruth. You don't just leave that behind," the woman said, her voice colder now. Ruth took a step forward. "Maybe we all have things we've done that we're not proud of, but that doesn't mean we can't change." The group was silent, their eyes flicking between Ruth and Alice's past, the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. But Ruth wasn't going to let them dictate the terms anymore. She wasn't going to stand back and watch them tear Alice down, not when she knew the truth. "I won't let you drive her away," Ruth said firmly. "She stays here, and if you have a problem with that, then you'll have to take it up with me." The woman opened her mouth to speak, but Ruth didn't give her the chance. She slammed the door shut, the sound loud in the quiet house. Inside, Ruth stood for a long moment, her breath coming in heavy. Bursts. She had done it. She had stood up to them, to the town, to the expectations that had been placed on her for years. But there was still a weight in her chest, a lingering feeling that wouldn't go away. She wasn't sure what she had just done, or if it would even make a difference, but she knew one thing: she wasn't backing down anymore. Alice appeared in the doorway, her eyes watching Ruth with something soft in them, something she hadn't seen before. It was a look that made her heart tighten in her chest. "You didn't have to do that," Alice said quietly. "I did," Ruth replied, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "You're not going anywhere." Alice didn't say anything else, but the tension between them was palpable. There was a shift now, something that hadn't been there before. Ruth felt it, deep in her bones. They were quiet for a long time after that, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between them. Alice didn't move to leave, didn't retreat like she usually did. She just stayed there, watching Ruth, her face unreadable. Ruth walked over to the table and sat down, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what was happening between them anymore. She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but she could feel the walls between them cracking bit by bit. She could feel the bond growing between them, even if it terrified her. Alice finally sat down beside her, the chair creaking under her weight. There was a moment of silence before Alice spoke, her voice soft. "You really mean that?" she asked, her eyes meeting Ruth's. "You're really going to stand by me?" Ruth turned to face her, her gaze steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Alice, not this time." Alice looked away, her shoulders tense. Ruth watched her, her heart aching. She wanted to reach out, to pull Alice closer, but she didn't. She knew it wasn't the time yet. but the distance between them felt smaller now, more manageable. "I'm not used to this," Alice said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not used to someone sticking around." Ruth took a deep breath, her voice steady. "You don't have to get used to it. You just have to trust me." Alice didn't answer right away. She just sat there, her body still, her eyes distant. But Ruth could see the shift in her, the way her walls were starting to come down, the way she was beginning to trust, even if she wasn't sure how. The town would never accept them. The sheriff would never stop trying to drag Alice's past into their present. But Ruth didn't care anymore. She wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to let Alice go. They didn't need the town's approval. They had each other. And that was enough. For the first time, Ruth realized that the quiet rebellion they had started, the bond they had formed, wasn't about defying the world. It was about finding peace in the chaos, about creating something that no one else could touch. And in that moment, Ruth knew she would fight for it. She would fight for Alice, no matter what it cost her. The day started like any other, but the tension in the air was palpable, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. Ruth felt it the moment she stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, but there was something different in the quiet, something that made her skin crawl. Alice was sitting on the porch steps, her head down, her fingers nervously picking at the hem of her shirt. Ruth stood at the door, watching her, the unease in her chest growing. Alice hadn't said much all day. It wasn't like her. Ruth's gaze lingered on the way Alice held herself, tense, as if waiting for something to happen. "You all right?" Ruth asked, stepping outside, the words coming out too softly. Alice didn't look up right away. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, distant. "They're here," Alice said, her voice barely a whisper. Ruth's stomach tightened. "Who?" Alice took a deep breath, her shoulders shifting as she finally raised her eyes to meet Ruth's. "The ones I left behind, the ones who won't let me go." Ruth stepped forward, her pulse quickening. "They're in town?" Alice nodded slowly. "They've been watching, waiting." Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. She had known this moment was coming. Alice's past had never been something Ruth could ignore, not completely. But hearing the words spoken aloud made it real. The figures from Alice's gang days, shadowed ghosts of a life Ruth didn't know, were back, and they were threatening the fragile peace they'd built. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, growing louder. Ruth could hear the slow, deliberate approach of a rider. Her heart sank. The sheriff. He wasn't coming to make peace. She knew it. He never did. Alice stood up, her movements stiff. "They're here to finish what they started." Ruth felt a cold chill settle in her bones. She hadn't been prepared for this. She hadn't been prepared for Alice's past to return like this, not after everything they had fought for. The past had a way of dragging its chains, no matter how far they ran. The sheriff rode into view, his silhouette cutting through the dusk, his horse moving with a slow, deliberate gait. He pulled up in front of the house, his eyes scanning the porch, then resting on Alice. "I told you it wouldn't end," he said, his voice cold and familiar. "You can't hide from what you've done, Alice." Alice's posture stiffened, but she didn't back down. Ruth watched her, the mix of fear and defiance in Alice's eyes. There was no running now. The past had caught up with them both. "I'm not hiding," Alice said firmly. "I've left that life behind." The sheriff shook his head, his lips curling into a thin smile. "You can't just walk away from what you were. Not that easily. It's in your blood. It always will." "Be?" Ruth stood there, her fists clenched at her sides. She couldn't just let him speak to Alice like that. She couldn't just stand by and watch the sheriff tear her down again, like he had done so many times before. "He's wrong, Alice," Ruth said, her voice firm, louder than she meant. "You've changed. You've earned that." Alice glanced at Ruth, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips, but it was fleeting, like something she didn't know how to hold on to. She turned back to the sheriff, her expression hardening. "I'm done with that life, Sheriff. I'm not running anymore." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Ruth felt her stomach drop as the sheriff dismounted from his horse, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Ruth's mind raced. The sheriff had come for Alice, but Ruth was the one he needed to control now. The town had never accepted Alice. They hadn't accepted Ruth either, but this was different. This was a test of everything they'd built. "Alice," Ruth said, her voice softer now, the words coming with a hesitation she couldn't hide. "You don't have to face him alone." Alice didn't turn to her, but Ruth could feel the weight of her decision. The world they had tried to build, the quiet rebellion they had started, was crumbling before their eyes. Alice's past was always going to be a shadow between them, no matter how hard they tried to outrun it, but that didn't mean they had to hide from it anymore. Alice took a step forward, her eyes steady as she faced the sheriff. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Ruth's heart beat faster. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving Alice. Not now, not after everything. The sheriff stared at them both, his gaze hardening. "You think you can just change? That you can walk away from all of this? You'll never be free, Alice. There's always someone looking for you. Always someone wanting something." Ruth stepped forward, standing beside Alice. She could feel the weight of the sheriff's words in her chest, but she wasn't going to let him win. Not now. "I don't care what you think, Sheriff," Ruth said, her voice low but clear. "You don't get to decide who she is anymore." The sheriff looked at Ruth, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. It wasn't a threat he was making. It was a warning, but Ruth didn't back down. "You've crossed a line, Sheriff," Alice said, her voice steady, calm, "and I'm not running from you anymore." The sheriff stared at them for a long moment, his face hard, before he turned and walked back to his horse. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He knew it was over. Ruth watched him leave, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the distance. She turned to Alice, her heart pounding in her chest. "You didn't have to face him alone," Ruth said again, her voice softer this time. Alice looked at her, a flicker of something passing between them, something raw, something real. "I wasn't alone," Alice replied, her voice quiet but sure. For the first time in a long time, Ruth felt something shift inside her. They had stood up to the past, to the town, to the sheriff. But more than that, they had stood together. And that made all the difference. Ruth didn't know what came next, but for the first time, she didn't care. She wasn't running anymore. Neither of them were. They had each other, and that was enough. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. Ruth and Alice stood side by side, their hands gripping the shovel. The ground was hard, the earth stubborn, but Ruth didn't mind the effort. The weight of the past had been heavy, and it felt right, for the first time in a long time, to put something down. Together, they dug. There was no need for words. They didn't have to speak to understand each other anymore. The house, the land, it wasn't just Ruth's anymore. It wasn't just Alice's either. It was theirs. It was the future they had made for themselves, away from the ghosts that had followed them for so long. They planted the stake deep into the ground, securing the ribbon to it, a symbol, simple but final. Ruth felt the quiet power of the act, the way the earth accepted it, the way it welcomed them. They had claimed this place, this life, and nothing could take it from them now. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Ruth's heart stilled. She knew it was coming. The sheriff. His last visit had been the end of one chapter, but Ruth knew there was one last page to turn. She wasn't ready for it, but she was no longer afraid. Alice stepped forward, her stance unwavering. She had faced the past, but this was different. This was their future, and no one could take it from them. Ruth watched her heart swelling with a fierce kind of love. The sheriff arrived soon after, his horse kicking up dust as it came to a halt. His face was hard, his eyes scanning the land, but Ruth didn't flinch. She stepped forward, standing by Alice. There was no fear in her now. "You two think you can just keep living here?" the sheriff asked, his voice cold. Ruth met his gaze, her voice steady. "This is ours now. It always was, even when you tried to take it." The sheriff's gaze flickered between them. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. He knew the fight was over. Ruth had made her choice, and there was no turning back. He turned away, mounting his horse without another word. Ruth didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. The past had no more hold on her. Alice turned to Ruth, her face softer than Ruth had ever seen it. "Are you sure about this?" Alice asked, her voice low. Ruth nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. This is my life, our life, and I'm not letting go. They didn't need a grand ceremony. They didn't need anyone else to witness it. They had each other, and that was enough. That night, they sat together under the stars, the quiet weight of their decision settling between them. Ruth's hand found Alice's, their fingers intertwining with ease. The land, the house, everything had changed, but this moment, was theirs. I never thought I'd find peace again, Ruth said, her voice quiet but steady. You did, Alice replied softly. We both did. Ruth smiled, leaning against Alice, feeling the warmth of her presence. For the first time in so long, Ruth felt the weight lift from her chest. This was where she belonged. This was the life they had built, and it was more than enough. They didn't need anyone else. They had each other. And that was all they'd ever need. Ruth stood in the doorway, watching as Alice paced in the yard, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. The air was cool now, the kind of cool that whispered of new beginnings. Ruth felt it in her bones, in the steady thrum of her heart. This was it. This was the moment. Alice stopped walking and turned toward her, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You ready? Ruth didn't answer at first. She just took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Alice. There was no fanfare, no grand speeches, just the quiet certainty that had settled between them. They didn't need anyone else to witness this. They didn't need the town's approval. It was theirs, the choice they'd made. And that was enough. Yeah, Ruth said finally, her voice steady. I'm ready. The small ceremony was nothing more than the two of them, standing in front of their home, the place they had built together. The same house that had once been a prison for Ruth's grief now felt like a sanctuary, no longer just a shelter, but a home. The past was behind them now, and for the first time, the future felt open, unmarked, like they were writing their own story. Ruth took Alice's hand, their fingers locking together as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Alice didn't speak, but the quiet understanding between them was enough. No words were necessary. They had found a peace that neither of them had known before, a peace that didn't require the approval of anyone else. No one in town knew. They didn't need to know. This wasn't for them. It was for Ruth and Alice. It was for the life they had chosen, the life they were starting together. The wind picked up, the scent of earth and wood mixing with the cool air, and for a moment, Ruth closed her eyes. She could feel it, everything that had brought them here, everything that had been lost and found again. And in that moment, Ruth knew it didn't matter if anyone ever understood. The town, the sheriff, the people who had never believed in them, it didn't matter anymore. They had each other, and that was enough. Alice stood beside her, her eyes soft, steady. Ruth glanced at her, the weight of everything shifting. The life they had made was far from perfect. It was uncertain, but it was theirs. Are you sure about this? Alice asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth looked at her, a smile tugging at her lips. I've never been more sure of anything. Together, they stood there, side by side, not needing anyone else to validate what they had built. The past was gone, the future unknown, but in this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be. Ruth squeezed Alice's hand, feeling the pulse of something deep and unwavering between them. The world outside would never understand. They didn't need to. Ruth and Alice had found their own truth, and that was all that mattered. They turned toward the house, walking back into the life they had built, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.